The deed was signed on a Tuesday morning in 1974, and the man who signed it understood exactly what he was agreeing to. 50 years. 50 harvests. A debt so large it had no business sitting on the shoulders of a man who owned nothing but a mule, a good name, and the kind of stubbornness that gets passed down through families like a physical trait. His name was Earl, and the morning he put his hand to that paper, he was 31 years old, and his wife Ruby stood beside him in her good dress, the one she kept for church and funerals and moments that needed to be honoured. Neither of them said much on the drive home. The fields were already his in every way that mattered, had been his family's land in spirit for 3 generations. Worked by his father and his father's father as sharecroppers who never quite owned what their hands had grown. Now it was his on paper too, if he could hold it, and he intended to hold it. What Earl did not know that Tuesday morning, what he could not have guessed standing in that county office with red clay on his boots, was that 50 years later, 3 people would be sitting in a car outside that same building, watching through the glass, waiting for him to walk out, waiting to see his face when everything finally changed. Every year of those 50 was a cost he paid in full. You ought to know that before the rest of it. He never missed a payment, not once. Not in drought years when the corn came up stunted and pale, not in the year the tractor broke in March and he finished the planting season behind a borrowed machine that stalled every 40 minutes. Not when Ruby got sick in 1991 and the hospital bills stacked up on the kitchen table like leaves. He paid them too, and he kept paying the farm. His daughter Loretta used to say her father didn't sleep the way other men slept. He rested, she said. There was a difference. If you have ever watched a person carry something for 50 years, you know what it does to the body. Earl's hands, by the time he was past 70, were something to behold. The knuckles were wide, and the skin across them had toughened into something that no longer looked quite like skin. And when he gripped something, a door handle or a grandchild's shoulder, you felt the weight of every season in it. He stood 6 feet and had stood 6 feet all his adult life, though the last decade had begun the slow negotiation with gravity that comes for everyone eventually. He still rose at 5 in the morning. He still walked the fence line after breakfast. He still kept his accounts in the same green ledger he had used for 30 years, the numbers written in the careful hand of a man who had taught himself to be precise about money because precision was the only thing standing between him and losing what he had. He had 3 grandchildren. Marcus was 28, the oldest, worked in Atlanta doing something with computers that Earl had never fully understood, but had followed with a quiet pride he expressed mainly by cutting out articles he didn't understand and saving them in a drawer. Deja was 25, a registered nurse at a hospital in Nashville, the grandchild who had inherited Earl's specific stubbornness and wore it better than he did. And then there was the youngest, Coop, short for Cooper, 22, and still finding his footing, working 2 jobs and taking classes at night, the one who called on Sunday evenings just to talk, sometimes for an hour, about nothing in particular. Earl had raised all 3 of them, or close enough to it. Their mother Loretta had done the primary work, but the farm had shaped them the way a place shapes children who grow up working it. They knew what things cost. They knew what it meant to tend something. The debt was due to be retired on September the 9th. Earl had known the date for 50 years, the way he knew his own birthday, the way he knew the date Ruby died, the way he knew the dates that carved a life into, before and after. Loretta had asked him what he wanted to do to mark it, and he had said he didn't need a fuss. He just wanted to go to the county office, make the final payment himself, and drive back to the farm, and sit on the porch for a while. That was all. He had told her this in July, on the phone, and she had said, "Yes, Daddy." And he had heard something in her voice that he couldn't quite name. He thought maybe she was emotional about it. He didn't press. What none of them had told him was that all 3 grandchildren had been working on something for the better part of a year. It had started with Marcus, who had been going through some old papers the previous fall, helping Loretta sort through a box of documents she'd kept in the back bedroom, and had found the original loan documents from 1974. He had sat with them for a long time. He had done the math. He had called Deja that night, and then Deja had called Coop, and by the end of that week, the 3 of them had a plan they hadn't told a soul about, except each other. Earl drove himself to the county office on September the 9th. He wore his good shirt, the blue one Ruby had bought him years ago that he had preserved with the care of a man who understood that certain things needed to last. He carried the green ledger under his arm and the final payment in a white envelope in his shirt pocket. The drive was 40 minutes on roads he had driven so many times the route lived in his hands more than his mind. He parked the truck in the same lot he had parked in 100 times over 50 years and walked inside and sat down at the counter and waited for the clerk to call his number. When she did, he set the ledger on the counter and slid the envelope across and told her quietly that this was the final payment on parcel 1140, the Earl James Farm, and he'd been waiting to say those words for 50 years. She looked up at him when he said it. She was young, probably hadn't been born when he signed the original papers, and she looked at his face and seemed to understand that something was happening here that was bigger than the transaction in front of her, and she said, "Give me a moment, sir." And she went to get her supervisor. What no one had told Earl was that Marcus, Deja, and Cooper were sitting in a rental car in the parking lot outside, watching through the glass door. Marcus had driven up from Atlanta the night before and slept on the couch at Loretta's house without Earl knowing he was there. Deja had flown in from Nashville that morning early, and Loretta had picked her up from the airport at 6 a.m. and they had stopped for coffee and cried a little in the car before either of them had said much. Coop had driven up the day before too and had been the hardest to keep quiet because Coop had always been the one who wore his heart on the outside where everyone could see it. He had wanted to tell Grandpa. He had wanted to tell him so badly that Deja had, at one point, taken his phone away from him for the better part of an afternoon. They had all three parked in the far corner of the lot and watched Earl's truck pull in, and watched him get out and adjust his shirt and walk inside with the green ledger under his arm, and none of them said anything for a moment after he disappeared through the door. Then Coop said, "He's wearing the blue shirt," and Deja said, "Yes, he is." And Marcus said nothing, just watched the door. If you have ever had someone in your life who carried something for 50 years and never set it down, not once, not for a single season, you already know what was in that parking lot. You know the feeling. It doesn't have a clean name. It is something between grief and gratitude, and a love so large it has no appropriate expression, so it just sits in the chest and presses outward. The plan had 3 parts. The first part Marcus had handled alone, and he had not told Deja or Coop the full extent of it until the papers were already drawn. He had hired a land attorney in November of the previous year and had spent 4 months working through a process Earl had not known existed. A process by which the descendants of sharecroppers who had worked land for generations, land that had been promised or implied or understood to be theirs under arrangements that were never honoured, could pursue a formal legal recognition of that history. It was not a guarantee of anything, it was a process. But Marcus had gone through it anyway, meeting after meeting, document after document, and what had come out the other side was not money and was not land, but was something that mattered in a different register. It was a formal county acknowledgement, 3 paragraphs in careful legal language, that recognised Earl's family's continuous stewardship and labour on that parcel, dating back to 1921. His grandfather's grandfather. 50 years of debt on top of 50 years of uncompensated work on top of 50 years more before that. The county did not owe Earl anything it could repay, but it could say so, officially, in writing, and it would. The second part was Deja's, and it was the part that had cost the most. She had done it quietly, month by month, the same way Earl had done everything, and she had not told anyone how she managed it on a nurse's salary, except that she had started before she had the money and had trusted herself to find it, and she had. She had paid off the last 17 months of Earl's loan, not all 50 years, not even close to all of it, but the last 17 months, the ones that remained when she started, were gone, retired, paid from her own account directly to the county land office in a process the attorney had confirmed was legal and clean and binding. Earl's final payment that morning was not the final payment. His final payment had been the second to last one, the August cheque he had written and mailed without knowing it was no longer necessary. The white envelope in his shirt pocket held a cheque for a debt that had already been settled. The third part was Coop's, and it was the smallest and the most important. He had gone to the farm 2 weeks before, on a day he had told Earl he was just coming by to help with a fence repair that needed doing, which was true, and while they worked together through the afternoon, he had quietly taken the green ledger when Earl set it down to get water from the truck and had photographed every page of it. 50 years of payments in Earl's careful hand, every number, every date. He had taken those photographs to a print shop in town and had them reproduced on archival paper, bound in a green cloth cover that matched the original as close as he could get it, and on the inside front cover he had written, in his own handwriting, a single line. He had not shown it to Marcus or Deja. He had kept it in the back seat of his car in a paper bag for 2 weeks, which had required a discipline no one in his family would have expected from him, and which he was privately proud of. Earl sat at the counter while the supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who had worked in the county land office for 22 years, came out from the back room with a folder in his hand and a look on his face that Earl could not immediately read. Gerald set the folder on the counter and opened it and said, "Mr. James, I believe you're here to close out parcel 1140. Earl said he was. Gerald said, "Before I process this payment, I need to show you something," and he turned the folder so Earl could see what was inside. The first page was a letter on county letterhead. Earl picked it up and read it slowly, the way he read everything, and Gerald watched him, and after a moment Earl set it back down on the counter and looked at Gerald and said, "This says the balance was satisfied in August." Gerald said, "Yes, sir, it does." Earl said, "I sent my August payment, same as I always do." Gerald said, "Yes, sir, you did, and we've returned that cheque to your address. You should receive it in a day or two. There was a prior payment made against the remaining balance." Earl looked at the letter again. He said, "Who made this payment?" Gerald said, "I can't speak to that, Mr. James, except to tell you the payment was made by a family member." Earl was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the green ledger on the counter. He said, "The balance is retired." Gerald said, "Yes, sir." "Completely." Earl said, "This farm is clear." Gerald said, "Yes, sir. Free and clear as of August the 9th. Earl put his hand flat on the counter. He did not say anything for a moment. Gerald said, "There's one more thing in that folder, Mr. James, if you'd like to look." The county acknowledgement was 3 paragraphs, and Earl read each one twice. It named his great-grandfather, Horace James, who had first worked that parcel in 1921. It named his grandfather, Clement James, and his father, Rufus James. And it named Earl himself, and it said, in the formal, careful language of official documents, that the continuous stewardship of that land by the James family represented an uninterrupted labour of more than 100 years on a parcel that had been their home in every way that mattered long before it was theirs in law. It was not restitution. It was recognition. It was the county saying, "We see what this cost, and who paid it, and how long they paid it, in writing, in a document that would be filed and kept." Earl sat with that paper for a long time. Gerald did not hurry him. Outside in the parking lot, Deja had her hand pressed over her mouth watching through the glass. Coop had one hand on the door handle because he could not sit still one more minute. Marcus was watching his grandfather's shoulders, and what he saw in them was something he would carry the rest of his life. The moment when a man who had held himself straight for 50 years let something go. Not collapsing, not breaking, just releasing. The way a held breath finally leaves the body. Slowly and completely. Earl stood up from the counter and shook Gerald's hand and walked toward the door. He pushed it open and stopped. All 3 of them were standing in the parking lot, 5 feet from the door. Marcus with his hands in his pockets. Deja with her hand still at her mouth, eyes bright. Coop holding a paper bag to his chest with both arms. Earl looked at the 3 of them, and the 3 of them looked at him, and nobody said anything for a moment that stretched long enough to hold 50 years inside it. Deja was the first one to move. She crossed the 5 feet between them and put her arms around him, and he held her. And then Coop came in from the side, still holding the paper bag, and pressed his face into Earl's shoulder, and Marcus stood just behind them with his hand on his grandfather's back, and the 4 of them stood in the parking lot of the county land office on a September morning with the light coming in, low and warm. And nobody said a word for a long time because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already being said by the standing there. When they finally stepped apart, Earl looked at each of them. He looked at Marcus and said, "You did the letter." It was not a question. Marcus said, "Yes, sir, I did." Earl nodded once. He looked at Deja and said, "And you settled the balance," she said. "The last 17 months," he said. "That was your savings." She said, "Grandpa, it was money." He said, "It wasn't nothing." She said, "No, it wasn't nothing." He reached out and touched her face once, just briefly, and she pressed her hand over his. Then he looked at Coop, who was still holding the paper bag. Coop held it out without saying anything. Earl took it and reached inside and brought out the green cloth book. He turned it over in his hands and opened the front cover and read the line written there in Coop's handwriting. His lips moved slightly as he read it. He closed it again and held it against his chest. He did not tell them what the line said. That was between Coop and him. What Coop had written was simple, the way the truest things usually are. He had written, You held this land, now it holds you back. Earl stood there in the September light with the green book against his chest and looked at the 3 people his daughter had raised on the farm he had worked for 50 years. And what was on his face was not triumph and was not relief, though both of those things were in it. What was on his face was the expression of a man who had spent his whole life doing what he believed was right, quietly, without anyone watching, and who had just discovered that someone had been watching the whole time. Not a stranger. Not a stranger at all. They drove back to the farm in 2 cars, Marcus and Deja in the rental, Earl and Coop in the truck. Earl drove and Coop sat in the passenger seat the way he had when he was 7 years old coming home from church on Sunday mornings, and for the most part they were quiet, but somewhere around the 20-minute mark Earl said, "You kept that secret 2 weeks. Coop said, "I kept it 17 days. Earl said, "That's a long time for you." Coop said, "Don't I know it?" Earl made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he generally got, a short exhale through his nose, and he shook his head slightly, and Coop smiled out the window at the passing fields. Loretta was on the porch when they pulled in, and she came down the steps and held her father for a long time without speaking, and he let her. He had known, he said later, that she was part of it because she was his daughter and there wasn't much she could hide from him, and he'd known since July that her voice on the phone carried something she wasn't saying. She laughed when he told her that and said she had tried so hard, and he said, "You did fine, baby. I didn't know the shape of it, just that something was coming." They ate together that afternoon on the farm, the 5 of them, at the table where Earl had eaten every morning for 50 years. Loretta had made his favourites, and there was sweet tea, and there was cornbread, and there was a pie that Deja had contributed in the form of a specific request she'd called in to a bakery in town, and for most of the meal they just talked the way families talk when they are all together and not trying to perform anything. Coop told a story about a raccoon that had gotten into the storage shed the previous spring that got funnier each time he told it. Marcus talked about his drive up from Atlanta and the traffic outside the city. Deja told them about a patient at the hospital who had sent her a card that she kept in her locker and read when shifts were hard. At some point in the late afternoon, when the light had turned the amber that late summer afternoon light turns on clear days, Earl got up from the table and walked out to the porch, and after a few minutes Marcus came and stood beside him. They looked out at the fields together. The land ran flat and then rose gently at the far end where the tree line began, oaks mostly. Big ones, the kind that took a century to get that large. Earl had walked to those trees thousands of times, his grandfather had walked to them, his father had. Marcus said, "I looked for Horace's name in every record I could find." Earl said, "My grandmother used to talk about him. Said he was quiet, but people listened when he did speak." Marcus said, "The records go back to 21 clear, continuous." The attorney said that mattered for the acknowledgement. Earl said it mattered before the acknowledgement. Marcus looked at him and said, "Yes, sir, I know it did. The world does not always catch up to what is true." Earl James had known that for 50 years, had held the knowledge of it the way you hold a stone, not bitterly, not in resentment, but as a fact about the weight of things. He had kept his accounts in the green ledger because precision was the only thing that protected him, and he had never missed a payment because missing a payment was the kind of opening that took things from people who looked like him, and he had risen at 5 every morning because the work was not going to do itself, and because the work was also a form of love, directed at his family, at the land, at the memory of every James who had worked it before him, and everyone who might work it after. He had not expected the world to notice. He had not expected a county letter with his great-grandfather's name in it, or a balance settled by his granddaughter's savings, or a green cloth book with a line written in his youngest grandchild's handwriting. He had not expected any of it. And it had come anyway. When the sun was nearly down, Earl picked up the green cloth book from where he had set it on the porch railing and held it in his hands for a moment, looking at it. Coop was in the yard throwing a stick for the old dog, who retrieved it with the enthusiasm of a much younger animal, and brought it back, and waited. Earl watched them. He watched the light go the colour it goes right before it's gone. That particular last warmth that seems to concentrate itself at the final moment, as if giving the day one more thing to offer. And he thought about Ruby, the way he thought about her every day. And he thought about his father Rufus, and what Rufus would have made of the county letter with Horace's name in it, and he thought it might have been worth something to Rufus. Might have been worth quite a lot, and he intended to think that until he could not think anymore. If you have watched someone tend a thing for 50 years and never waver, you already know what this story is about. It is not about the debt retiring. The debt was always going to retire because Earl was always going to pay it. What this story is about is the green cloth book on the porch railing and what Coop had written on the inside cover and the look on an old man's face in a parking lot on a September morning when he discovered that the people who loved him most had been watching him work his whole life and had decided, in their own quiet way, that it was their turn. The dog brought the stick back and dropped it at Coop's feet and looked up at him and waited. Coop threw it again. Earl set the green book on the small table beside his chair where he kept his coffee in the mornings, and he sat down, and the farm settled around him in the September dusk the way it had settled around him every evening for 50 years. And for the first time in any of those evenings, the land under it all held no number, carried no balance, owed nothing to anyone. It was simply his. It had always been his. Now the paper said so too, and so did 3 people somewhere inside that house who had made sure of it, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Have you ever watched someone finally put down something they carried for 50 years? Leave a comment and tell us what that looked like, because this family wants to know they are not alone. And if this story moved you, stay close, because there is another one waiting about a woman who cleaned the same office building for 30 years without knowing who watched her leave every night. There were things Earl had never told anyone about those 50 years. Not even Loretta, not even Ruby, while she was alive. Small private reckonings that a man carries and does not share because some costs are not for other people to hold. The year the corn was short, 1983, he had been $400 behind in October and had said nothing to anyone and had taken a second job cutting pulpwood on weekends from late October through January to make it right before the year turned. Ruby had known something was different. She always knew. She had made biscuits every morning that winter with extra care, thick and hot, and had set them on the table without mentioning why the portions were small at dinner, and he had loved her for the dignity of the silence and for the biscuits both. He had made up the 400 and had not been late again. There was the spring of 1997 when a man named Carroll, who had worked adjacent land for 30 years, had made Earl an offer on the Eastern Acres, 47 of them, at a price that was generous and would have retired 10 years of payments in one transaction. Earl had sat with the offer for a week. He had held it up against the ledger and the math had been plain and the temptation had been real, and at the end of the week he had driven to Carroll's house and thanked him and said, "No." Carroll had nodded. He had said, I figured. He had said, "Your grandfather farmed those acres." Earl had said, "Yes, sir." Carroll had said, "I understand." And that had been that. He had told Loretta about Carroll's offer a few years later when she was old enough to understand what he had turned down, and she had looked at him a long time before she spoke. She'd said, "Daddy, were you scared?" He had thought about it. He had said, not of him, she had said, of what, then? He had said of the acre line moving, of it being smaller, of starting to cut it down piece by piece. You start with 47 acres and then you tell yourself the next 47 are just practical. And then you're telling your children about land you remember instead of land you have. She had understood that. This was the interior of a man who had been tending something for 50 years, a man whose grandchildren did not know the half of it because he had not told them the half of it, because the job of carrying a thing is to carry it yourself and not redistribute the weight to people who have their own weights to carry. That is not stubbornness. It is love. It looks like the same thing from the outside, and maybe it is the same thing, but the difference, if there is one, is in the direction. Stubbornness holds things in for yourself. The other kind holds them in for other people. Earl James had been doing the other kind for 5 decades. Marcus had known some of this, though not the Carroll offer and not the pulpwood winter, because Marcus had been the oldest and the most observant, and he had grown up watching his grandfather the way you watch a person you're trying to learn from. Not consciously, not as a project, but the way a child absorbs a thing by proximity. He had watched Earl balance the ledger every Sunday evening after supper. The same ritual every week, the same pen, the same angle of the lamp, the same careful way he tracked every figure twice before closing the book. He had understood early that the ledger was not just a record, it was a discipline, and the discipline was a form of dignity, the insistence on accounting for yourself precisely, not leaving room for anyone to question your numbers or challenge your standing, because the ledger was proof that you were current, that you were exact, that you couldn't be dismissed. When Marcus had found the original 1974 loan documents in that cardboard box, he had not called Deja immediately. He had held them in both hands for 20 minutes first. He had read the terms, the interest rate, the payment schedule, the acreage description, the names of the parties. His grandfather's signature at the bottom was the same signature as in the ledger, the same careful, unhurried hand. The date had been stamped in red ink, September 9th, 1974, and reading it, Marcus had thought about his grandfather at 31, young enough to be Marcus's contemporary, standing in that county office with red clay on his boots and everything still in front of him, every payment still unmade. He had thought about what it meant to sign something that would take 50 years to complete, and then to complete it. He had sat in the back bedroom of his mother's house for a long time with those papers in his hands, and when he finally set them down, he already knew what he was going to do, though it would be another 3 days before he had the words to explain it to Deja. Deja had cried on the phone when he explained the legal process, and Marcus had let her, and then she had said, "What do I do?" And he had said, "Whatever you can manage, whatever feels right," and she had been quiet for a moment and had said, I've been saving since I got my first real nursing paycheck. I don't know why exactly. I just kept putting money aside and I didn't spend it because I kept thinking it needed to be for something that mattered." Marcus had said it was waiting for this, and she had cried again, and so had he, briefly before they both gathered themselves and started talking about logistics. The 17 months had been $2,412, which was not a great sum against the scale of 50 years, but which was every month that remained, and the completeness of it mattered to Deja in a way she would have had difficulty explaining to anyone who had not grown up watching Earl keep the ledger. It could not be partial. It had to be the whole remaining thing, or it was just money. Coop's contribution had started as something smaller. He had thought about a gift, something bought, and had set that aside because anything bought felt wrong against the ledger's 50 years of made-by-hand accounting. He had thought about a letter and had written 3 drafts that he had thrown away because none of them said the right thing. He had stood in the storage shed in early August helping his grandfather sort old equipment, and had watched Earl pick up a rusted tool and turn it in his hands the way he turned any object that had once served him, with a kind of inventory attention, and had noticed that Earl set it back down on the same shelf he had taken it from, and something about that precise habit, the putting back, the keeping of the right place for each thing, had given Coop the idea. The ledger pages photographed cleanly on his phone in good light, and the print shop had done excellent work. The green cloth cover had taken him 3 tries to source, visiting 2 fabric stores before he found the right weight and shade. He had stayed up past midnight to bind it himself, following a tutorial, his big hands clumsy with the glue and the awl, and Loretta had heard him at the kitchen table at 1 a.m, and had come out and looked at what he was doing, and had sat down across from him without speaking and watched him work until he was done. She had asked to read the line before he put the cover on. He had shown her and she had read it and looked up at him and said, "Baby, that is exactly right." He had said, "You think so?" She had said, "Your grandfather is going to hold that book like it is something alive." He had looked back down at it and said, "I hope so." When Earl had read the line in the parking lot and pressed the book to his chest, Coop had not been watching him directly because Coop had been watching Deja, whose face in that moment had done something he needed to memorize. She had brought one hand to her cheek, and her eyes had gone bright and wide, and she had looked like a person who had carried a secret for a long time and had finally been able to set it down, which was exactly what she was. Coop had looked at that face and thought, "We did right. Whatever it cost and however long it took to keep quiet, we did right." Later that evening, after supper, when the light had fully gone and the sky had taken on the deep blue of early night and the first few stars had appeared, Earl asked Marcus to walk with him to the far end of the east field where Carol's offer would have cut the land. They walked without a flashlight because Earl had walked that field in the dark so many times he did not need one, and Marcus stayed 1 step behind and to the left the way he had as a boy, when his grandfather walked ahead of him and he was trying to match his stride. At the far corner of the east field they stopped. The tree line was there, the big oaks black against the early night sky. Earl said, "You put my great-grandfather's name in that letter." Marcus said, "Horace James, 1921. Earl said, "He never owned it." Marcus said, "No, sir." Earl said, "But he worked it." Marcus said, Every record I found said so. Sharecrop arrangements, tax filings that named the parcel. Labour records from the county agricultural files. It goes back to 21 clean. Earl stood looking at the oaks. He said he planted some of those. Marcus looked at the trees, the oldest ones thick enough that two people could not reach around them. He said, "Yes, sir. I believe he probably did. There are things that can be measured and things that cannot." The ledger could measure 50 years of payments, and the county letter could name 4 generations. But what stood in the dark at the edge of the east field was not a thing the ledger captured or the letter contained. It was the fact of it, plain and enormous, the simple fact that Horace James had planted trees he would never live to see grown, and that his great-grandson stood under them 100 years later, and the land was paid for and free, and held by the same family that had always held it, and the paperwork finally said so. Earl had spent 50 years making that true on paper. Horace had spent his life making it true in the ground. Both of them had paid full price. Both of them had held. Earl put his hand on the bark of the nearest oak and left it there for a moment. He said, "Your grandmother would have liked that letter." Marcus said, "I know she would have." Earl said, "She would have framed it, somewhere nobody would miss it." He said this without any particular emotion, which was how he said most things about Ruby, and which Marcus understood was not the absence of feeling, but its exact opposite. They stood there a little longer, and then Earl turned, and they walked back toward the house, where the lights were on, and the sound of Deja's laugh carried clearly across the evening quiet. And somewhere near the porch, Coop was still out with the dog, the stick still going back and forth in the dark because neither of them was willing to call it a night. Earl went up the porch steps and stopped at the small table beside his chair and picked up the green cloth book and took it inside. The morning after, he rose at 5. He made his coffee. He carried it to the porch and sat in his chair in the early September cool, the sky still grey and the birds just starting, and he held the book in his lap. The farm was quiet the way it was only at that hour, a quiet that felt earned, the long quiet at the end of something that had finally finished. He set his coffee down and opened the book to the inside front cover and read the line one more time, though he had it by heart already. He held it. The fields took shape slowly in the growing light, the rows visible, the soil familiar, the far tree line emerging from the dark in the patient way it emerged every morning, becoming itself again, offering itself to a new day. He had watched this happen thousands of times, and it had not become ordinary to him. That was something he had noticed about himself over the years, that the mornings had not become ordinary, that each one still arrived as itself, and he still received it as such. And he took that to be a form of grace, the particular mercy given to people who pay attention. The land was his. All of it and always, from the first ploughing his great-grandfather had done in 1921 to the last payment retired in the books of the county on a Tuesday in September, and the ledger that recorded it all, both the original worn green one and the new cloth-covered one Coop had made with his own hands, would sit on the table by his chair for as long as he sat in it. He heard the screen door, and Coop came out in his socks, carrying a second coffee, and sat on the top porch step the way he always sat, shoulders rounded, both hands around the mug, looking out at the fields. They sat together in the early light without speaking. After a while, Coop said, "It's a good piece of land." Earl said, "Yes, it is."